Welcome to the MyBard story.
And hello, everyone. Glad you could join us for this deep dive. We're opening up our study note today, looking at a passage that's, well, probably familiar, but also
Yeah.
maybe a bit uncomfortable for many of us. Abram's journey down to Egypt in Genesis chapter 12.
Right, this section, verses 10 through 20 specifically, it throws Abram into this really significant test. And it happens right after he receives these incredible, just world-changing promises from God.
Yeah, it's quite the contrast.
And what we see is this mix of very human fear, some decisions that are, let's be honest, deeply questionable, and then God's surprising, powerful intervention.
Absolutely. Our notes for this dive pull together insights from, a range of scholars. They help us peel back the layers, understand the historical context, the literary stuff the narrator emphasizes, and the really weighty theological implications of this key event in Abram's life.
So our plan is to unpack this narrative, see what jumps out, and then explore some fascinating insights from our sources, things that might challenge our assumptions, maybe, and offer some vital lessons for our own faith journeys and, well, for ministry today.
Sounds good. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's jump right in then. We'll start with Genesis 12, picking up at verse 10, reading from the NIV. Now, there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe.
So, boom, right away, the problem hits. A severe famine. And it's in Canaan, the very land God just promised Abram.
Not just a little bit hungry then.
No, our notes point out the Hebrew words really emphasize how severe, how heavy this famine was. It was a genuine crisis in the ancient Near East.
Yeah.
Threat to survival.
And heading to Egypt makes sense, doesn't it? With the Nile, it was always the sort of the breadbasket of the region.
Absolutely, from a purely practical standpoint. You go where the food is.
And the text says he intended to live there for a while.
Right, lower shum in Hebrew. It suggests a temporary stay, not a permanent move away from the promised land. It was meant as a refuge.
Okay.
But here's the first thing our notes flag up. This decision to go down to Egypt. Well, it doesn't seem to follow an explicit command from God.
Unlike his call to leave Haran back in verse 1.
Exactly. That was a clear go from God.
Mhm.
This feels more like Abram relying on his own, very human, very practical judgment in a tough situation.
So a move driven by necessity, by human logic, maybe lacking that explicit faith step we saw earlier. And, this takes them straight into some pretty deep water.
It certainly does, because as they get close to Egypt, a whole new fear pops up.
Let's read verses 11 through 13 together. His fear and his plan really come out right as they're about to cross the border. Verse 11. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. Verse 12. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Verse 13. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you.
Wow, the tension just ramps right up, doesn't it? They're on the doorstep of Egypt, and Abram spells out this stark fear about Sarai.
And she's, around 65 at this point? Our notes mention that?
Yeah, based on the later chronology.
Yeah.
Yet the text makes a point of her exceptional beauty. Yeah, Pat Mark.
That's quite something in itself. 65 and beautiful enough to cause international incidents.
It is. And for Abram, suddenly her beauty isn't just a fact, it's a perceived threat. He's in a foreign land, no tribal backup, no legal standing.
So he thinks they'll want her.
Right. His calculation in verse 12 is just chillingly pragmatic. Powerful men will desire Sarai, and the quickest way to get her is just to eliminate the husband. He's genuinely afraid for his life.
And that fear leads straight to this scheme in verse 13. Say, you are my sister. Imrina, please say.
Exactly. Now, our notes mention there was this scholarly discussion for a while, Spicer's idea about Newsy customs.
Right, the wife's sister thing as some kind of legal status.
Yeah, the idea that calling your wife sister might have offered some sort of elevated status or protection based on these Hurrian texts. Maybe Abram was trying to protect Sarai that way.
But that feels really counter to how the story plays out. I mean, the lie puts her in more danger, doesn't it?
Precisely. And that's what most scholars today argue. People like Greengus, Van Cedars, Matthews. The notes confirm the Newsy parallels aren't really a good fit. The narrator here in Genesis clearly presents this as a deception. It's born out of Abram's fear for himself.
Not some clever legal move.
No. Matthews suggests it might have been a desperate stalling tactic. Maybe he thought as the brother he could negotiate, buy time, instead of facing immediate death as the husband. But whatever the nuance, it puts Sarai at huge risk.
And his priority seems to be his own skin. My life will be spared because of you.
It's not exactly trusting God's promise back in 12.3 to protect him, is it?
Not at all. It's human cunning taking over from faith.
And sadly, his fear about her beauty turns out to be spot on. Let's look at verses 14 and 15. Verse 14. When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Verse 15. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace.
So Abram's assessment was right. The Egyptians, Hamirim, immediately saw she was very beautiful. And things escalate fast. It's not just random people noticing, it's Pharaoh's officials.
Yeah, Abart, they saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh himself, the great house.
And then she was taken into his palace. What to qua? That passive verb you mentioned, our notes highlight it. She has no say.
None at all. She's just taken. And this is where Abram's plan completely unravels, isn't it? Maybe he thought he'd get some gifts, stall for time.
But instead, she's whisked away to the palace.
And crucially, our notes stress being taken into Pharaoh's palace, that part almost certainly meant one thing. She was intended for his harem, for marriage.
Which puts the promised lineage, the whole point of God's call and promises, in direct jeopardy from the most powerful man around.
Exactly. Abram's scheme didn't just endanger Sarai's safety and honor. It threatened God's entire redemptive plan through his descendants. It's a huge crisis point for the covenant.
And then comes this really bizarre, ironic twist in verse 16. Verse 16, he treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men servants and maidservants, and camels.
This verse is just wow. Abram was treated well, Chethath. He gets rich, acquires all this wealth, livestock, Mackay, servants even, camels, Gomelim, because Sarai was taken.
It looks like a bride price, or gifts for her family, right?
That's how it reads. He got exactly what verse 13 says he hoped for, materially to be treated well, to profit, but the cost is immense. Sarai's safety, her honor, the covenant's integrity.
It's a terrible trade-off.
It is, and scholars like Sarna and Baldwin really point out this deep irony. Abram prospers materially, yes, but it's through a scheme born of fear and deceit. It's not like the blessings promised through faith back in verses 2 and 3.
Sarna's quote in the notes is powerful, isn't it? That Abram leaves wealthy, but unlike others whose wealth is tied to God's blessing, his comes through. Well, something else.
Exactly. It's prosperity gained through questionable means, directly linked to his failure of faith.
Our notes also touched on that debate about the camels, Gomelium, an anachronism maybe.
Yeah, Albright suggested that. But others, like Kitchen, Sarna, Walke, they argue that limited domestication for, high-status transport or wealth display is plausible this early.
So maybe the camels just emphasize how much wealth he gained.
Could be. Just piles on the irony. Worldly success achieved at the cost of spiritual and relational integrity.
But just when it looks like the promise is about to be completely derailed, God steps in. Verse 17. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife, Sarai.
This is the pivot. And knows who acts. The Lord, Yahweh. The covenant God takes direct action.
He doesn't wait for Abram to figure things out.
Not at all. He inflicted serious diseases, or literally struck Pharaoh great plagues when Naga Yahweh at Peri Mashlim. And our notes point out that Hebrew word for plagues, Nuniyam.
It's the same word used for the Exodus plagues later on.
Exactly. It's this powerful echo, this foreshadowing. God's pattern of protecting his people in Egypt starts right here with Abram and Sarai.
Amazing. Do we know what kind of diseases?
The text doesn't specify. But scholars like Walken and Hamilton suggest they were probably severe and somehow clearly linked to Pharaoh's designs on Sarai, maybe affecting fertility or the royal household in a way that made the cause obvious to Pharaoh.
And the text is explicit about why. Because of Sarai, Abram's wife, Alantar Sarai rish to arm.
Yes. God is protecting Sarai. He's protecting his covenant promises even though Abram dropped the ball completely. And Pharaoh, even if he acted in ignorance about the marriage initially, is held accountable.
And these plagues lead Pharaoh to figure things out, right? Which brings us to the confrontation in verse 18. Verse 18. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What is this you have done to me, he said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?
Pharaoh connects the dots. The plagues, Sarai. He gets it. And he calls Abram on the carpet. His question, Madon She'ali, what is this you have done to me? It's full of indignation. He sees Abram's lie as a direct wrong against him.
And his follow-up questions just hammer it home. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?
He highlights Abram's deception. And it's pretty striking, isn't it? As our notes from Sarna and Baldwin point out, Here's this pagan king,
Yeah, showing more moral integrity at this moment.
more concerned for truthfulness, for the sanctity of marriage, than the patriarch himself showed in this situation. This is a deeply humbling moment for Abram.
And what's Abram's response?
Silence. Nothing. The text records no defense, no excuse.
Which speaks volumes.
It really does. Walke and Sarna interpret that silence in verses 18 and 19 as a tacit admission of guilt, of shame. He knows he messed up. He has nothing to say.
Pharaoh just wants the situation resolved. He presses the point in verse 19. Verse 19, why did you say, she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here's your wife. Take her and go.
He makes the link crystal clear. Your lie, what's kwe, led me to take her to be my wife. So Pharaoh confirms his intention, confirms the danger Sarai was in.
And then the command. Here's your wife. Take her. Go. What I need to call you. Just get out.
Yeah, it's an expulsion, plain and simple. It resolves the crisis for Sarai, thank God, and preserves the covenant line. But Abram leaves under this cloud of rebuke, sent packing by a pagan ruler he deceived.
And verse 20 shows Pharaoh making sure they actually leave. Verse 20. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had.
Pharaoh gives the orders to his men. They escort Abram, Sarai, and crucially, everything he had, Winnacles Shiloh, out of Egypt, including all that wealth he just got.
So he leaves richer, but in disgrace.
Exactly. And our notes highlight that verb again, sent him away, Wayao Shelah. It's from the same root Shelah used when God drove Adam and Eve from Eden.
And when Pharaoh sends Israel out of Egypt in Exodus?
Right. That word choice feels deliberate, connecting Abram's shameful expulsion here to other major forced departures. It underscores that this isn't a victory lap for Abram. It's a departure forced by his failure, even though God providentially orchestrates it for rescue. He leaves in shame, yet wealthier, saved by God's grace from the mess his own fear created. It's an incident that, despite Abram's failure, is incredibly instructive and, as we'll see, even foreshadows what's to come for his descendants.
Wow, that verse by verse really brings out the drama, doesn't it? The human fear, the divine rescue, it's intense. But our study note has some really fascinating extra layers from scholars, helping us dig deeper and maybe catch some of those aha moments. What stood out to you from those perspectives in the notes?
You're right, there's definitely more going on here. One area that scholars have really wrestled with, as we kind of touched on, is this whole wife-sister thing. You know, beyond that newsy parallel theory that tried to make it a legal custom, which most scholars now see is not quite fitting.
Right, the text really frames it as deception.
Exactly. But scholars like Walke, Matthews, and Alexander point out something really important. This isn't just a one-off mistake for Abram. This happens 3 times in Genesis.
3 times, with Abram again and Isaac too.
Yes. Here in chapter 12, then Abram, as Abraham does it again in chapter 20 with Abimelech, and then Isaac pulls the same trick in chapter 26, also with Abimelech.
That's quite a pattern. It can't just be coincidence.
No way. They see this repetition as a deliberate literary strategy, almost like a type scene. It represents this recurring vulnerability, this specific test for the patriarchs when they're in foreign territory. The matriarch, and therefore the promised lineage, gets put in danger, often because the patriarch resorts to fear or deception.
So it highlights a specific weak spot for them.
It seems so. And the power of that repetition, as someone like Alexander points out, is that in every single case, God steps in. He intervenes decisively to protect the woman and preserve the covenant line.
So the pattern highlights God's faithfulness even more strongly against their repeated failure.
Precisely. It underscores divine reliability in the face of very human, repeated vulnerability.
Yeah.
God keeps his promises even when his chosen people stumble in the same way again and again.
Okay, and digging into Abram's character here in chapter 12, Sarna and Walke really emphasize that jarring contrast, don't they? Between the Abram who just stepped out in faith in verses 1 to 9.
Yeah, leaving everything behind based on God's word.
And then the fearful, scheming Abram entering Egypt just a few verses later. It's quite a switch.
It really is. Sarna suggests Abram's main driver here was self-preservation. Maybe he rationalized it, if I die, the promise dies with me. But his method, as Sarna notes, was deeply flawed. It didn't actually make him safer, it created a bigger crisis.
Right.
And Walke just nails it as a failure to trust God's specific promise of protection from verse 3. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you when faced with real hardship. He opts for human scheming instead.
And then there's that incredible irony about the wealth he gains. That quote from Sarna is just so sharp. Abram leaves rich, but unlike others whose prosperity is clearly tied to God's blessing on their faithfulness, his wealth comes through. Well, Decidedly not divine blessing on his actions.
That's a critical point. It complicates any simple prosperity gospel reading. Yes, he got wealthy, but it wasn't a reward for his deception. God's grace rescued him despite the deception, and he happened to keep the payoff from the failed scheme. It shows God's overarching plan can work even through our messes, but it absolutely doesn't endorse the mess itself.
And Baldwin even connects that wealth, that Egyptian richness, to Lot's temptation later in chapter 13, suggesting that wealth gained through compromise can be a spiritual danger itself.
That's a sobering thought, too.
And another fascinating angle the notes bring out, Sarna, Baldwin, Hamilton all mention it, is that moral contrast with Pharaoh.
Yeah, this is where it gets really uncomfortable for Abram, and maybe for us reading it. Here's the pagan king, technically wronged by Abram's lie, even if he didn't know she was married at first, who ends up confronting Abram with surprising moral clarity.
His questions, what have you done to me, why didn't you tell me? They show this basic sense of right and wrong, of honesty, of respecting marriage that Abram seemed to bypass in his fear.
It's humbling. The great patriarch getting schooled on ethics by Pharaoh. It shows that moral insight isn't, exclusive to the covenant community. God can use anyone, even an outsider, to deliver a necessary rebuke.
And Abram's response, just silence.
Which, as Walke and Sarna suggest, is basically his confession. Shame, guilt, knowing he has no leg to stand on.
Okay, and finally, there's this really rich theological layer scholars like Walke and Sarna point out, the typological connection. Abram in Egypt prefiguring Israel in Egypt.
Yes, this is where the story gets even bigger. Think through the parallels they highlight. Abram goes down to Egypt because of famine. The promised seed, represented by Sarai, is endangered there. God intervenes with plagues targeting the ruler and his household.
Right.
And then Abram and Sarai ascend from Egypt, paradoxically, with wealth acquired there.
And every single one of those points matches the Exodus story. Israel goes down due to famine.
Right, end of Genesis.
They become endangered, enslaved.
Exodus 1.
God sends plagues on Pharaoh in Egypt.
Exodus 7 through 12.
And they leave Egypt. They ascend with wealth from the Egyptians.
Exodus 12. It's an incredibly tight parallel. Waltkin calls it canonical foreshadowing. Abram's personal history isn't just his story. It sets the pattern for the entire nation's redemption story. It shows God's consistent way of protecting his covenant people and delivering them from danger in Egypt right from the very beginning. It ties the whole narrative together beautifully.
Wow. Yeah, those insights really do make the passage just resonate on so many levels. It's far more than just a simple story of, Abram messing up. But let's shift gears a bit. Moving from the study and the scholarship, what does this ancient story mean for us right now? How does this deep dive speak to pastors, to believers, trying to live faithfully and lead ministries in today's world?
Yeah, that's the crucial question, isn't it? And I think the first, maybe the most obvious, but still vital reminder from this passage, something our notes really stress, is just the stark reality of fear and failure in the life of faith, even for the greats.
This isn't a story about a superhero of faith.
Not at all. Abram, the patriarch, the one who received these amazing promises, is shown here to be deeply susceptible to fear when things get tough. Real hardship hits famine, potential danger, and his reaction. It's driven by fear, and that fear leads him straight into deception, compromise, and endangering everything God promised.
And that feels incredibly relevant because we face our own famines in life and ministry, don't we? Financial stress in the church, maybe relational conflict, personal health scares, discouragement when ministry feels like it's stalling, just the pressure.
Absolutely. And our first instinct, our very human reaction, can be just like Abram's, driven by fear, by self-preservation, maybe trying to control the outcome ourselves.
Yeah, it's tempting, isn't it, to rely on our own plans, our strategies, maybe, bend the truth just a little bit for what seems like a good cause or just to survive instead of fully trusting God.
Exactly. As John Walden points out in the notes, Abram fundamentally failed to trust God for protection here. So this story is this powerful reminder that the faith journey isn't some smooth upward curve of perfect obedience. It includes these moments of intense testing and, yes, potential failure. It calls us, especially as leaders, to be honest about our own struggles with fear, our own temptations to compromise, as Baldwin wisely notes.
Okay, but then the flip side of that, the second huge reminder, is God's incredible, unfailing providence and grace. And that is such good news, right? Because even though Abram failed spectacularly here,
It was a major lapse in faith and ethics.
God did not abandon him. He didn't tear up the covenant promises.
That's the grace that just shines through this whole mess. The Lord stepped in, decisively, Not because Abram earned it or deserved rescue at that point, but because God himself is faithful. Faithful to his word, faithful to his purposes.
He protected Sarai. He
Yeah.
got Abram out of there, albeit maybe a bit red-faced.
Right. As Hamilton and Wolfke emphasized in the notes, God's faithfulness isn't dependent on our perfection. Thank goodness. His plan moves forward, not because we're always strong or wise, but because he is sovereign and gracious.
This incident is just this powerful proof of God's commitment to his promises and his people, even when we make huge mistakes. It gives so much hope, especially for those of us in ministry who feel the weight of our own imperfections, our own failures. God's grace really is sufficient, even when we stumble badly. His rescue isn't tied to our performance.
And third, the passage is also a pretty stark warning, isn't it? About the dangers of relying on our own cleverness, our human cunning, instead of seeking and trusting God's guidance.
Abram's decision to go to Egypt in the first place. Maybe not explicitly wrong, but not clearly directed by God either.
Right, it seems pragmatic, but then his plan in Egypt, the whole sister-lie thing, that was purely his own invention, born out of fear. And that human attempt to control the situation through deceit led straight into a crisis he couldn't fix himself. Only God could get him out.
And that's a serious caution for us as leaders today, isn't it? When we face those church challenges, the budget shortfall, the difficult personalities, the pressure to grow or look successful, where do we turn first?
Yeah, are we tempted to lean primarily on the latest strategic plan, the clever marketing idea, the organizational fix? Maybe even, cutting ethical corners slightly, being less than fully transparent because it seems like the quickest way to solve the problem.
Instead of really diligently seeking God's will, through prayer, through his word, trusting him for the provision and the outcome, even if his way seems slower or harder.
Exactly. Baldwin reminds us that compromise, even a half-truth, it has consequences. It can lead to shame, it can damage our witness, even if God's grace ultimately rescues the situation. And that scene with Pharaoh, the pagan king calling out Abram's lack of integrity, that should humble us. It underscores how vital absolute truthfulness is, especially for those leading God's people.
Okay, and finally, there's a picture of hope here too, right? The path back after failure. Our notes mention what Abram does when he leaves Egypt.
Yes, this is crucial. Genesis 13 tells us he goes back to Bethel, back to the place between Bethel and Ai where he had first built an altar and called on the name of the Lord before he went down to Egypt.
That simple action, as Baldwin notes, feels really significant.
It really is. After the whole humiliating experience being caught, rebuked by Pharaoh, expelled, Abram doesn't just, sulk off and try to justify himself. His response is, effectively, repentance. It's a return to fellowship with God.
Going back to the place of worship, back to the altar.
Recentering himself in that relationship with Yahweh that he had seemingly put on hold when fear took over.
And for us, that's such a key reminder. When we inevitably mess up in our faith, in our decisions, in our leadership, the most important thing isn't to get stuck in guilt or despair. It's to turn back to God.
To confess, seek forgiveness, re-anchor ourselves in his presence, his grace, his promises. Abram's return to Bethel is this beautiful, simple picture of restoration after failure. It shows the way forward is always back to God, back to worship, back to depending solely on him. So when we pull it all together, this deep dive into just these few verses, Genesis 12.0220, it reveals this really complex, deeply human story running alongside profound divine truth. We see faith being tested by real hardship.
We see the uncomfortable reality of human fear and failure, even in someone like Abram.
We see surprising moral standards showing up outside the covenant community.
And maybe most powerfully, we see God's absolutely unwavering commitment to protecting his covenant and his people, even when we, through our own flawed actions, put everything at risk.
Yeah, it's a vital reminder that the heroes of the Bible, they weren't plaster saints. They were real people, complex, imperfect, just like us.
And their stories aren't just about their successes, but maybe even more powerfully about God's incredible grace and faithfulness working through, and sometimes despite, their weaknesses. It shows us God's plan is so much bigger than our mistakes. He is utterly committed to seeing his promises through and preserving his people even when we falter. So for those of us serving in ministry, leading congregations, what does this specific episode in Abram's life really challenge us to think about regarding our own leadership, our own vulnerabilities, and how we actually model faith and dependence on God?
Yeah, it really forces us to ask some hard questions, doesn't it? When ministry faces its own kind of famine, maybe it's financial strain, maybe it's burnout, conflict, discouragement, whatever form it takes, what's our default mode? Are we more instinctively prone to rely on our own resources, our own strategies, the clever planning, the marketing techniques, the human wisdom that feels tangible? Or do we first and most fundamentally turn to the Lord in genuine, humble dependence and trust. Even when, frankly, that path feels less certain, less efficient, less practical in the moment. Abram's story, while it showcases God's amazing grace despite his failure, it also stands as this powerful call, especially for pastoral leaders, to model authentic faith and uncompromising integrity. To really trust that God is more than capable of protecting us, protecting his church, and accomplishing his purposes, even in the most challenging circumstances we could possibly face. It pushes us to examine if our actions truly reflect deep trust in God's providence, or if they're just, pragmatic attempts at self-preservation or achieving what looks like success in the world's eyes.
That is a searching question. Well, this has been a really significant deep dive today. So much to process and reflect on there. We really hope this exploration of Abram's time in Egypt has been insightful and maybe ultimately encouraging for you too.
Thank you so much for joining us. Keep digging into the text. Keep seeking God's wisdom, especially when you face your own famines. And above all, keep trusting in his unfailing grace. It truly is sufficient, even and perhaps especially when we fail.